The rope bit into her wrists. The crowd wanted blood. In the frozen heart of Red Hollow, they tied Eliza Boone to a chair in the town square, not for murder, not for violence, but for stealing scraps meant for pigs. The mayor's voice cut through the winter air like a blade, turning her hunger into a crime and her desperation into theater. Stones flew. Insults burned worse than the cold. Then a stranger stepped forward and everything changed. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The cold didn't care who you were. It came down from the mountains like something with teeth, settling into the valley where Red Hollow crouched against the wilderness. The town itself looked like it had been carved out of spite. Wooden buildings weathered gray, streets packed with frozen mud, smoke rising from chimneys in thin, desperate threads. This wasn't a place people came to. It was a place people got stuck. Eliza Boone knew that better than most. She stood in the center of the square, hands bound behind her back, rope cutting into her wrists until she couldn't feel her fingers anymore. The chair beneath her creaked with every shiver that ran through her body. She'd stopped trying to hold still. There wasn't any point. They'd already decided what she was. Mayor Hackett stood 10 feet away, his coat lined with fur that Eliza knew damn well didn't come from any animal he'd hunted himself. His face was red from more than just the cold. There was satisfaction there, the kind that came from having an audience. This, he said, gesturing toward her like she was livestock at auction, is what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. Eliza would have laughed if her mouth wasn't so dry. Fed her. The man wouldn't piss on her if she was on fire. Around them, the crowd had gathered, maybe 40 people, maybe more. Hard to tell when you couldn't lift your head without someone shoving it back down. She recognized most of them. Mrs. Talbot, who ran the boarding house and had thrown Eliza's belongings into the street 3 winters back. Daniel Cray, the blacksmith's son, who'd once cornered her behind the livery and called it courting when she'd had to break his nose to get away. The widow Marsh, clutching her shawl like Eliza's very presence might contaminate the air. They all had one thing in common. They'd all needed her at some point, needed her to haul water when their backs gave out, needed her to mend what they couldn't afford to replace, needed her to do the work nobody else wanted for the scraps nobody else would eat, until she took something without asking. She was caught red-handed, Hackett continued, his voice carrying across the square. In the grain house, filling her pockets with feed meant for the livestock. It was barely a handful, Eliza said. Her voice came out rough, smaller than she wanted it to. Hackett's head snapped toward her. Did I give you permission to speak? She hadn't expected him to, but sitting there silent while he lied felt worse than the cold. Oats, she said, forcing the words out. Oats that were going moldy in the corner. The horses wouldn't even touch them. That ain't for you to decide, someone shouted from the crowd. She thought it might have been Cray. Property's property, Hackett said. And theft's theft. Doesn't matter if it's gold or grain. You take what isn't yours. You pay the price. A rock hit her shoulder. Not big enough to do real damage, but enough to sting. She didn't flinch. Wouldn't give them that. Another rock followed. This one caught her cheek, and she tasted copper. You want to know what she is? Hackett said, warming to his audience now. She's a parasite. Been living off this town's charity for years. Charity? The word tore out of Eliza before she could stop it. I worked for every scrap you people threw at me. I didn't ask for charity. I asked for wages, and you laughed in my face. Hackett's expression shifted, just for a second, and Eliza saw something flicker there. Not shame. He didn't have enough humanity left for that, but recognition, maybe. An acknowledgement that she was right, and that it didn't matter one damn bit. See? He said to the crowd. Ungrateful. Entitled. This is what happens when you show kindness to people like her. They think they're owed something. People like her. She'd heard that phrase her whole life, spoken in a dozen different tones, all of them meaning the same thing, less than. Ought to run her out of town, someone said. Ought to do worse, said another voice, and there were murmurs of agreement. Eliza's chest tightened. She'd known this could go bad, but hearing it out loud, hearing them discuss her fate like she wasn't even there, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Hackett raised a hand, calling for quiet. He was enjoying this. She could see it in the way he stood, chest puffed out, playing to the crowd like an actor on a stage. Now, I'm not a cruel man, he said, and Eliza nearly choked on the absurdity of it. But I am a just one, and justice demands consequences. He nodded toward two men standing at the edge of the crowd, the Garrett brothers, both of them thick-necked and mean-eyed. They stepped forward, grinning. 20 lashes, Hackett said. Administered here, in front of everyone, so we all remember what happens when you steal from this town. The cold seemed to deepen. Eliza's breath came faster now, shallow and quick. 20 lashes would tear her apart. She'd seen what a whip could do to a person. She wouldn't survive it. Not in this cold. Not without help afterward, and nobody here was going to help her. The older Garrett brother pulled a coiled whip from his belt, letting it unwind slowly. The leather looked stiff in the cold, which somehow made it worse. Wait, the voice cut through the square like a knife, sharp and clear and utterly calm. Everyone turned. The man who'd spoken stood at the far edge of the crowd, just outside the ring of onlookers. He was tall, taller than anyone Eliza had ever seen, with shoulders that filled out his heavy coat and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. Dark hair fell past his collar, and his eyes were the kind of pale gray that looked almost silver in certain light. He didn't look like he belonged in Red Hollow. He looked like something out of a story, the kind her mother used to tell before the fever took her, about men who walked out of the wilderness and changed everything just by being there. "Who the hell are you?" Hackett demanded. The stranger didn't answer right away. He took his time, stepping into the square with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured. "Name's Caleb Rourke. I'm passing through." "Then keep passing," Hackett said. "This doesn't concern you." "Seems to me it concerns everyone here." Rourke's gaze swept the crowd, lingering on faces until people started shifting their weight, suddenly uncomfortable. "You're about to whip a woman for stealing oats." "She broke the law." "Did she?" Rourke looked at Eliza for the first time, and something in his expression made her breath catch. It wasn't pity, it was something else. Recognition, maybe. Like he'd seen this exact scene play out before and knew how it ended. "You got proof?" Rourke asked, turning back to Hackett. The mayor's face darkened. "I don't need to prove anything to you." Funny. Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a scared girl tied to a chair and a mob ready to beat her to death over some horse feed. He paused, letting that sink in. That how justice works in Red Hollow? "You don't know what you're talking about," Hackett said, but there was an edge to his voice now, defensive. "Don't I?" Rourke took another step forward. "Let me guess, she's got no family, no money, no friends to speak for her. Makes her an easy target, doesn't it? Nobody's going to ask questions if she disappears." "She's a thief." "Then call the law. Get a proper trial. Let a judge decide." Hackett's laugh was ugly. "We are the law out here, and we've already decided." The crowd murmured agreement, emboldened by their mayor's confidence. But Rourke didn't move. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, waiting. "You really want to do this?" Hackett said, and now there was a threat in his voice. "You really want to stand between us and our justice?" Rourke's expression didn't change. "I've stood between worse." For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind picked up, carrying snow across the square in thin, stinging sheets. Eliza could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard it hurt. Then Hackett nodded to the Garrett brothers. They moved fast, or tried to. The younger one lunged at Rourke, going for a tackle. Rourke sidestepped like he'd known it was coming, grabbed the man's coat, and used his momentum to send him sprawling face first into the frozen mud. The older brother swung the whip. Rourke caught it midair. Eliza didn't see how. One second the leather was cutting through the air toward his face, and the next it was wrapped around his forearm, held tight. He yanked hard, pulling Garrett off balance, then drove his other fist into the man's gut with a precision that made Garrett fold like paper. It was over in seconds. Both brothers were on the ground, gasping and groaning, and Rourke hadn't even broken a sweat. The crowd went silent. Hackett's hand moved toward his belt, where Eliza knew he kept a pistol. But Rourke saw it too. His own hand moved, just enough, and suddenly there was a revolver in his grip, pointed steady at the mayor's chest. "Don't," Rourke said quietly. Hackett froze. "You're making a mistake," the mayor said, trying to salvage some authority. "This is my town. These are my people. You can't just—" "I'm not doing anything," Rourke said. I'm just asking you to prove your case. You said she stole. Show me evidence. Show me a witness who isn't on your payroll. Show me anything other than your word and a mob." Silence. Hackett's jaw worked like he was chewing on glass. But he didn't have an answer, and everyone knew it. "That's what I thought," Rourke said. He lowered the gun, not holstering it, just pointing it at the ground, and walked toward Eliza. She didn't know what to expect, didn't know if she should hope or brace for something worse. But when he pulled a knife from his belt and cut the ropes binding her wrists, the relief was so sudden and overwhelming that she nearly collapsed. He caught her elbow, steadying her. His hand was warm even through her sleeve. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then let's go." "You can't," Hackett started, but Rourke cut him off with a look that could have frozen the sun. "I just did." He guided Eliza away from the chair, away from the crowd, his presence like a wall between her and everyone who wanted her blood. Nobody moved to stop them. Maybe they were too shocked. Maybe they were too smart. Or maybe they just recognized something in Caleb Rourke that told them trying to stop him would be the last mistake they ever made. They were halfway across the square when Hackett found his voice again. "You're both dead," he shouted. "You hear me? Nobody defies me in my town and lives to tell about it." Rourke didn't even turn around, just kept walking, one hand still on Eliza's arm guiding her forward. Behind them, the crowd began to stir, muttering, shifting, working themselves back up into something dangerous. But by then they'd reached the edge of the square, where Rourke's horse stood tied to a post. It was a massive animal, dark as midnight, with eyes that looked too intelligent for something that wasn't human. Rourke swung into the saddle with an ease that suggested he'd done it 10,000 times, then reached down. "Come on," he said. Eliza hesitated. She didn't know this man, didn't know if he was saving her or just claiming her for himself. But behind her she could hear the crowd getting louder, angrier, and she knew what they'd do if they caught her. She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him like she weighed nothing, then spurred the horse forward. They tore out of Red Hollow at a gallop, leaving the shouts and threats behind, swallowed by the wind and the falling snow. Eliza held on tight, her arms wrapped around Rourke's waist, her face pressed against his back. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, could smell leather and smoke and something wilder underneath. She didn't know where they were going, didn't know what would happen when they got there. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't tied to a chair waiting to be destroyed. And that, somehow, was enough. They rode for what felt like hours. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by distance and snow. And the landscape opened up into something vast and unforgiving. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks lost in cloud, and the trees grew thicker as they climbed. Eliza's hands had gone numb again, but she didn't let go. Couldn't let go. If she fell now, she'd be dead before Rourke even noticed. He didn't speak, didn't slow down, just kept the horse moving at a pace that ate up ground without burning the animal out. He knew what he was doing. That much was obvious. Finally, when Eliza was starting to think she might actually freeze to death on the back of this horse, he pulled up near a cluster of trees and dismounted. She tried to follow, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She slid off the saddle and hit the ground hard, her knees buckling. Rourke caught her before she could fall completely, his grip firm but not rough. "Easy," he said. She wanted to tell him she was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Her teeth were chattering too hard. He guided her to a fallen log and made her sit, then pulled off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was still warm from his body, and the weight of it felt like the first real kindness she'd experienced in years. "Wait here," he said, and walked back to the horse. Eliza watched him move, economical, precise, no wasted motion. He pulled a canteen from the saddlebag, along with something wrapped in cloth. When he came back, he handed her the canteen first. "Drink." She did. The water was cold enough to hurt her throat, but it was clean, and she drank until he gently pulled it away. "Not too fast, you'll make yourself sick." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a piece of dried meat and some hardtack. It wasn't much, but to Eliza it looked like a feast. "Eat," he said. She tore into the food without pretense, not caring how she looked or what he thought. Hunger had stripped away her pride a long time ago. Rourke didn't say anything, just watched her eat, his expression unreadable. When she finally slowed down, he spoke. "How long since you had a real meal?" She had to think about it. 3 days? Maybe 4? He nodded, like he'd expected that answer. And before Red Hollow? Where were you? Nowhere. The word came out flat. Been in Red Hollow since I was 12. Before that, she shrugged. Moved around with my ma. She died. I stayed. No other family? No. Another nod. He didn't press for details, didn't ask the questions everyone always asked. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you find help? Why didn't you do anything? Maybe because he already knew the answers. They're going to come after us, Eliza said. It wasn't a question. Probably. You shouldn't have helped me. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because it was true. Maybe because she needed to hear how he'd respond. Rourke's expression didn't change. Probably not. So why did you? For a long moment he didn't answer. He just looked at her, really looked at her, like he was trying to see past the hunger and the fear and the dirt to whatever was underneath. Because nobody else was going to, he said finally. It was the simplest answer in the world, and somehow the most devastating. Eliza looked away, blinking hard. She wasn't going to cry. She'd cried enough in her life, and it had never changed anything. Where are we going? She asked instead. North, into the mountains. I've got a place up there, small, out of the way. Nobody knows about it. You live alone? Yeah. Why? The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Same reason as you, probably. World's easier when you don't have to depend on anyone. Eliza thought about that. Thought about how many times she'd been let down, pushed aside, used up and thrown away. Thought about how she'd learned to survive by making herself small, invisible, unthreatening. I don't want to be a burden, she said quietly. You won't be. You don't know that. I know you hauled yourself through however many years in that town without breaking. That's not a burden. That's strength. She looked up at him, startled. Nobody had ever called her strong before. He stood, offering her his hand. Come on, we've got a few more hours before dark, and I want to put more distance between us and them. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. The coat was heavy on her shoulders, and it smelled like smoke and leather and something wild she couldn't name. As they walked back to the horse, she found herself glancing at him, this stranger who'd stepped into a mob and walked out with her life in his hands. Caleb, she said, testing his name. He looked at her. Thank you. He didn't answer, just nodded once, then helped her back onto the horse. And as they rode deeper into the wilderness, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile. Dangerous, even. Hope could kill you faster than the cold, but it was there. And for now, that was enough. The temperature dropped as they climbed higher. Eliza could feel it in her bones, the kind of cold that wasn't just uncomfortable, but actively hostile. Her breath came out in white clouds, and even wrapped in Rourke's coat, she couldn't stop shivering. He noticed. Of course he did. Not much further, he said over his shoulder. She wanted to believe him, but the landscape looked the same in every direction, trees and snow and rock, stretching on forever. Then the trees began to thin, and she saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, backed up against the mountain itself. It was built from logs that had weathered to the color of old bone, with a stone chimney and shuttered windows. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line, which meant someone had been there recently. Or something had been there recently. Rourke dismounted and helped her down, then led the horse to a small lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. There was hay there and water, and he tended to the animal with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to approach everything with. Eliza stood in the snow, hugging the coat tighter around herself, watching. When he was done, he walked to the cabin door and pushed it open. Come on. She followed him inside, and the warmth hit her like a physical thing. There was a fire burning in the hearth, not huge but steady, and the single room was simple but solid. A bed against one wall, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, a rifle mounted above the door. It wasn't much, but it was more than Eliza had ever had. Rourke moved to the fire, adding wood from a stack beside the hearth. Sit, he said, nodding toward one of the chairs. She sat, her legs weak with relief. He filled a pot with water from a barrel in the corner and set it over the fire, then rummaged through the shelves until he found a tin of coffee. The smell alone made her mouth water. While the water heated, he pulled off his gloves and rolled up his sleeves, His forearms were scarred, old wounds, long healed but visible, stories written in scar tissue. She wanted to ask about them, wanted to ask about everything, who he was, where he'd come from, why he'd risked his life for hers, but she didn't. Instead, she sat quietly and watched him work, and tried to remember the last time someone had made her coffee. She couldn't. When it was ready, he poured 2 cups and handed her one. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. "Drink it slow," he said. "Your stomach's not used to it." She sipped carefully, and the bitter warmth spread through her chest like sunlight. Rourke sat across from her, his own cup cradled in his hands. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she broke the silence. "Why do you live up here?" He took a long drink before answering. "Peace and quiet." "That's it?" "That's enough." She studied him over the rim of her cup. He didn't look like a man at peace. He looked like a man holding something at bay, something big and dark and hungry. "You were a soldier," she said. Not a question. His jaw tightened just slightly. "Yeah." "What happened?" "Nothing worth talking about." She should have let it drop. Should have respected the wall he'd just put up. But she didn't. "You saved my life today," she said. "I think I've earned more than nothing worth talking about." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not anger. Something else. Recognition, maybe. "Fair enough," he said finally. He set his cup down and leaned back in his chair. "I fought. For a long time. Lost people. Lost everything that mattered. When it was over, I didn't know how to be around people anymore. Didn't trust myself. So you came here. So I came here. And you've been alone ever since." "Yeah." Eliza took another sip of coffee, thinking, "That why you helped me? Because you know what it's like to be cast out?" "Maybe." He rubbed a hand over his face, and for the first time she saw how tired he looked. "Or maybe I'm just tired of watching people destroy each other over nothing." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. "They will come," Eliza said quietly. "Hackett won't let this go. Not after you embarrassed him in front of the whole town. I know. So what do we do?" "We?" He raised an eyebrow. "You said I could stay. Work. Decide my own future." She met his gaze head on. "I'm deciding. I'm staying." For a moment she thought he might argue, might tell her it was too dangerous, that she should run while she had the chance. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded slowly. "All right. Then we prepare." "For what?" His smile was thin and humorless. "For whatever they bring." That night, Eliza slept in a real bed for the first time in years. Rourke had insisted she take it, saying he'd sleep on the floor by the fire. She tried to argue, but he just looked at her with those pale gray eyes until she gave in. The mattress was thin and the blankets were rough, but they were clean, and they were hers for the night. She should have fallen asleep immediately. Instead, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire pop in the hearth. She could hear Rourke's breathing, slow and steady, the rhythm of someone who'd learned to sleep light and wake fast. She wondered what he'd seen in the war. Wondered what had happened to make him choose this, solitude, silence, a life carved out of the wilderness. Wondered if he'd ever regret saving her. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she'd start proving she was worth the risk. And when Hackett came, because he would come, she'd be ready. Or she'd die trying. Either way, she was done being a victim. Morning came cold and gray, the kind of dawn that made you wonder if the sun had given up entirely. Eliza woke to the smell of coffee and something cooking, actual food, not just the memory of it. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping in one position all night, afraid to move in case she woke up and found this was all a dream. But it wasn't. Rourke stood at the stove, his back to her, working a pan over the fire. He'd already been up for a while. She could tell from the way the room was warmer now, the fire built up high, and from the fresh snow he'd tracked in that was already melting into puddles near the door. "You're awake," he said without turning around. She pushed the blankets aside and stood, wincing as her feet hit the cold floor. "How'd you know?" "Your breathing changed." She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know if it was comforting or unsettling that he'd been paying that much attention. He turned, holding 2 tin plates. Sit. Eat. She did, and when he set the plate in front of her, she had to stop herself from just shoveling the food into her mouth like an animal. Eggs. Actual eggs. And some kind of salted meat, along with a piece of bread that was only a little stale. "Where'd you get eggs?" she asked. "There's a hen house out back. Small. 3 birds. They don't lay much this time of year, but it's something." She took a bite, and the taste nearly made her cry. Real food. Warm food. Food that someone had prepared for her without demanding anything in return. Rourke ate standing up, leaning against the wall near the window. He'd opened the shutters just enough to see out, and his eyes kept flicking to the tree line like he was expecting something. "You think they'll come today?" Eliza asked. "Maybe, maybe not. Hackett's not stupid. He'll want to bring enough men to make sure he wins." "How many is enough?" "For him, 10, maybe more." He took a drink of coffee, his expression flat. "He'll want to make an example. Can't let someone like me walk into his town and walk out with his prisoner." "I wasn't his prisoner." "He thought you were. That's what matters." Eliza pushed the eggs around her plate, her appetite fading despite how good the food was. "You could still leave. Take the horse and go. I'll stay here. Tell them you abandoned me. They wouldn't believe it. They might. They won't." He set his plate down and crossed his arms. "And even if they did, what do you think happens to you then?" She didn't answer. She already knew. "Besides," he said, his voice softer now, "I didn't bring you all the way up here just to leave you to them." Something in her chest tightened. She'd spent so long expecting nothing from people that kindness felt like a weapon she didn't know how to defend against. "Why?" The word came out smaller than she meant it to. "Why do you care?" Rourke was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and do nothing, and I'm done being one of them." The weight of that statement settled between them like snow. Eliza looked down at her plate, blinking hard. "I don't know how to repay you. Don't want repayment, just want you to survive." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They finished eating in silence, and when the plates were cleared, Rourke pulled on his coat. "I need to check the perimeter. Make sure nobody's been sniffing around. You stay inside. Keep the fire going. If you hear anything at all, you get the rifle and you lock that door. Understand? I don't know how to shoot." He paused, one hand on the door. "You know which end the bullet comes out of?" "Yeah." "Then you know enough. Point it at whatever scares you and pull the trigger. The gun does the rest." Before she could argue, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Eliza stood alone in the cabin, surrounded by warmth and silence, and tried not to think about how quickly that could all disappear. She spent the morning doing what she could to be useful. There wasn't much. Rourke kept the place tidy in that efficient, military way that left no room for clutter, but she found things. She swept the floor, organized the shelves, mended a tear in one of the blankets using a needle and thread she found in a small tin box. It felt good to work. Felt normal, in a way nothing had felt normal in years. She was folding the blanket when the door opened and Rourke came back in, stamping snow off his boots. "Anything?" she asked. "Tracks. Old ones, probably from a few days ago. Nobody's been close since then." "That's good, right?" "It's something." He pulled off his gloves and warmed his hands by the fire. "Doesn't mean they're not coming. Just means they haven't yet." Eliza set the blanket aside. "What do we do in the meantime?" "We prepare." He gestured toward the corner where a small stack of supplies sat. "I've got ammunition, enough food for a few weeks if we're careful, and enough firewood to last through the worst of it. But we need more." "More of what?" "Everything. Food, water, wood. If they come and we're stuck here for a while, we need to be able to outlast them." She nodded. "Tell me what to do." For the next several hours, they worked. Rourke showed her how to split wood. Not well, but enough to add to the pile. He taught her how to check the snares he'd set in the woods, how to tell fresh tracks from old ones, how to move quietly when the snow made every step sound like thunder. She wasn't good at any of it. Her hands blistered from the axe, and she tripped over roots she should have seen, and once she got turned around and had to call out for him to find her way back. But she tried, and Rourke didn't make her feel stupid for not knowing things she'd never had the chance to learn. By the time the sun started to sink, what little of it had been visible through the clouds, she was exhausted. Her whole body ached, and her hands were raw, but there was a satisfaction in it that she hadn't felt in a long time. They ate dinner by firelight. Rabbit that Rourke had caught in one of the snares, cooked with wild onions and some kind of root vegetable he'd pulled from a storage pit outside. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling, and Eliza ate every bite. "You did good today," Rourke said, breaking the silence. She looked up, surprised. "I barely kept up." "You kept up. That's what matters." She wanted to argue, but the expression on his face stopped her. He meant it, actually meant it. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and went back to his food. After dinner, Eliza washed the dishes in a basin of cold water while Rourke cleaned his rifle. She watched him work out of the corner of her eye, the way his hands moved with practiced precision, checking every part, making sure everything was ready. "You really think it'll come to shooting?" she asked. "Hope not, but hope's not a strategy." She dried the last plate and set it on the shelf. "You ever killed anyone?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and uncomfortable. Rourke didn't look up from the rifle. "Yeah." "How many?" "Enough?" She waited, but he didn't elaborate. After a moment, she tried again. "Does it get easier?" That made him pause. He set the rifle down and looked at her, really looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her stomach twist. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She nodded slowly. "Good." "Good?" "Means you're not a monster." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Jury's still out on that." Before she could respond, a sound cut through the night. Faint, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Rourke was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Get away from the window!" Eliza's heart slammed into her throat. She moved to the far corner of the room, pressing her back against the wall. Rourke cracked the shutter open just enough to see out, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. Silence. Then a voice called out from the darkness. "Rourke, we know you're in there!" Eliza recognized it immediately. "Hackett." Rourke didn't respond, just stood there, watching, waiting. "You've got something that belongs to us," Hackett shouted. "Send her out, and we'll let you walk away. You've got my word." Rourke's jaw tightened, but he still didn't speak. "We don't want trouble," Hackett continued. "We just want what's ours. She's a thief, Rourke. You know it. We know it. Law's on our side." "There is no law out here," Rourke said, his voice carrying through the walls. "Just men with guns pretending there is." A pause. Then Hackett's voice came back, colder now. "That's how you want to play it?" "I'm not playing." Another pause, longer this time. Eliza could hear murmuring, multiple voices, conferring. She tried to count them, but couldn't. At least 5. Maybe more. "You're making a mistake," Hackett said finally. "A big one. We'll give you until morning to think it over. After that, we're coming in." "I'll be waiting." More silence. Then the hoofbeats started again, fading back into the distance. Rourke stayed at the window for a long time, even after the sound was gone. "How many?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 8? Maybe 9. Hard to tell in the dark. "Can we hold them off?" "Depends on how smart they are." He finally turned away from the window, but he didn't put the rifle down. "They try to rush us. We've got a chance. They sit back and wait us out." He didn't finish the sentence. Eliza's hands were shaking. She pressed them together, trying to stop it. "This is my fault." "No, it's not. If I hadn't stolen, you were starving. You did what you had to do to survive. That's not a crime. That's being human." "Tell that to them." "I did." They didn't want to hear it. He set the rifle against the wall and moved to the fire, adding more wood. "Get some sleep while you can. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "You think I can sleep, knowing they're out there?" "You'd better try, because when they come, I'm going to need you sharp." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she couldn't just close her eyes and pretend everything was fine, but he was right. She knew he was right. So she climbed into the bed, fully dressed, and pulled the blankets up to her chin. Rourke sat by the fire, rifle across his lap, staring into the flames. She watched him for a long time, this stranger who'd become the only thing standing between her and death. "Caleb?" "Yeah? Why'd you really help me? And don't say it's because nobody else would. There's more to it than that." For a long moment, he didn't answer. The fire crackled, and somewhere outside an owl called through the darkness. Finally he spoke. I had a sister once, younger than me, sweet kid. After our parents died, I took care of her. Did my best anyway. When I went off to fight, I left her with people I thought I could trust. His voice went flat, emotionless. I was wrong. By the time I got back, she was gone. Worked to death in a mill town that didn't give a damn about her. Eliza's chest ached. I'm sorry. Yeah, me too. He poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. I wasn't there when she needed me. Couldn't save her. So when I saw you in that square... He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know. Maybe I thought I could make up for it somehow. You can't bring her back by saving me. I know that. Then why? He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Because maybe if I save you, it means she didn't die for nothing. Maybe it means there's still some good left in this world worth fighting for. The weight of that settled over her like a blanket. She'd be proud of you, Eliza said quietly. Your sister, for what you did today. Rourke's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. Get some sleep, Eliza. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, and somewhere in the darkness, 8 men waited for dawn. When morning came, it came fast and hard. Eliza woke to Rourke shaking her shoulder, his face grim. They're here. She sat up, her heart already racing. Where? Tree line, north and east. They're setting up positions. She scrambled out of bed and moved to the window, but Rourke caught her arm. Stay low. Don't give them a target. She nodded and crouched beside him, peering through the narrow gap in the shutters. At first she couldn't see anything, just trees and snow and the pale light of early morning. Then she saw movement, a flash of color. Brown coat, maybe, disappearing behind a trunk. Then another. And another. They were surrounding the cabin. What do we do? She asked. We wait. Let them make the first move. He checked his rifle, then pulled a revolver from his belt and handed it to her. You remember what I said? Point and shoot. That's right. Don't think about it. Don't hesitate. If someone comes through that door who isn't me, you put them down. Understand? She took the gun, her hands shaking. It was heavier than she expected and colder. I understand. Good girl. They waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Eliza's breathing sounded too loud in her own ears, and she could feel sweat beginning to bead on her forehead despite the cold. Then Hackett's voice rang out again. Last chance, Rourke. Send her out, and this ends peacefully. Rourke didn't answer. Stubborn bastard, Hackett shouted. Have it your way. The first shot shattered the morning silence. It punched through the shutter next to Rourke's head, sending splinters flying. He jerked back, cursing, and returned fire through the gap. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, bullets slamming into the cabin walls, thudding into the door, cracking through the shutters. The noise was deafening, overwhelming, and Eliza pressed herself against the floor, the revolver clutched in both hands. Rourke moved from window to window, firing with calm precision, making every shot count. He didn't waste ammunition, didn't panic. But there were too many of them. A bullet tore through the roof, sending dust and debris raining down. Another punched through the door, missing Eliza by inches. Stay down! Rourke shouted over the noise. She wanted to help, wanted to do something. But she was paralyzed, frozen by fear and the overwhelming chaos. Then the shooting stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. Rourke reloaded quickly, his eyes scanning the tree line. They're regrouping. How many did you get? 1 down for sure, maybe another wounded, but there's still at least 6 out there. Before she could respond, something crashed against the door. Once, twice. They were trying to break in. Rourke spun toward the door, rifle raised. Eliza, get behind the bed, now. She didn't argue, just scrambled across the floor and pressed herself into the corner, the revolver pointed at the door. The door shuddered under another impact. Wood cracked. Rourke fired through it, and someone screamed. The impacts stopped. You killed Danny, you son of a bitch, someone shouted from outside. He shouldn't have been trying to break down my door, Rourke shouted back. More gunfire, more bullets tearing through the walls. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, praying, not to any god, because she'd stopped believing in those a long time ago, but to something. Anything. Just let this end. Just let them survive. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a scraping, scratching sound coming from above. She looked up. Someone was on the roof. "Caleb!" she screamed. He turned just as the ceiling exploded inward, and a man dropped through, landing hard on the floor in a shower of wood and dust. The man came up fast, knife in hand, lunging at Rourke. Rourke sidestepped and brought the rifle butt down on the man's head with a sickening crack. He dropped like a stone. But the distraction had cost them. The door burst open, and two more men rushed in. Rourke shot the first one center mass. He went down hard. The second one tackled him before he could fire again, and they hit the floor in a tangle of limbs. Eliza raised the revolver, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The man on top of Rourke had his hands around his throat, squeezing, and Rourke's face was turning red. She had to do something. She pulled the trigger. The gun kicked in her hands, the noise so loud it felt like her skull was splitting open. The bullet went wide, punching into the wall. But it was enough. The man looked up, surprised, and Rourke used the distraction to drive his knee into the man's gut. The man doubled over, and Rourke rolled, coming up with the knife that had fallen from the first attacker's hand. He drove it into the man's side. The man screamed and fell back, clutching the wound. Rourke staggered to his feet, gasping for air, blood on his hands. Outside, someone was shouting orders, regrouping again. "We can't hold them," Rourke said, his voice hoarse. "There's too many. What do we do?" He looked around the cabin, his mind working fast. Then his eyes landed on something in the corner, a barrel, half full of lamp oil. "Can you ride?" he asked. "What?" "The horse. Can you ride?" I think so. Why?" "Because we're leaving." He grabbed the barrel and started pouring oil across the floor, splashing it on the walls. "Get outside. Go to the lean-to. Get the horse ready." "What are you doing?" "Buying us time." "Go." She didn't argue, just ran for the back window, climbing through it and dropping into the snow. The cold hit her like a fist, but she didn't stop. She ran to the lean-to, her feet slipping in the snow, and started fumbling with the horse's tether. Behind her, she heard glass breaking, smelled smoke. Then Rourke was there, grabbing the reins from her hands and swinging into the saddle. "Come on!" She grabbed his hand and he hauled her up behind him just as the cabin exploded into flame. The fire roared to life, sending black smoke billowing into the sky. Men shouted. Someone fired a shot, but it went wide. Rourke spurred the horse forward and they crashed through the woods at a dead run, branches whipping past, snow flying. Behind them, the cabin burned, and somewhere in the chaos, she heard Hackett screaming orders that nobody was listening to anymore. They rode hard for what felt like hours, the horse's breath coming in great gasps, foam flecking its mouth. Finally, when the cabin was miles behind them and the forest had swallowed them whole, Rourke slowed. Eliza clung to him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her face pressed against his back. She was shaking, couldn't stop shaking. "You did good," Rourke said, his voice rough. "You did real good." She wanted to believe him, but all she could see was the man she'd tried to shoot. The blood on Rourke's hands, the cabin burning behind them. Everything he'd had, everything he'd built, gone. Because of her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be. You lost everything." "No." He reached back and squeezed her hand just once. "I didn't." And despite everything, despite the fear and the cold and the uncertainty of what came next, Eliza felt something warm bloom in her chest. Hope. Dangerous, fragile, impossible hope. But real. And that, she thought, was worth fighting for. They didn't stop until the horse couldn't go any further. The animal's sides were heaving, its legs trembling, and Rourke finally pulled up in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. The branches hung low under the weight of snow, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the weak afternoon light. Eliza slid off first, her legs so numb she nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground. Rourke dismounted slower, favoring his left side, and she saw for the first time the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "It's nothing. That's not nothing. Let me see. Later." He led the horse to a tree and tied it, then started checking the saddlebags. "We need to figure out where we are first, how much time we have." "Time until what?" "Until they find us again." He pulled out a canteen and took a long drink, then offered it to her. Hackett's not going to let this go. Not after we burned his men and his pride. Eliza took the canteen with shaking hands. The water was ice cold and tasted like metal, but she drank it anyway. How many do you think are left? Hard to say. I got 2 for sure, maybe wounded another. That leaves at least 5. He winced as he moved, pressing a hand to his side. Enough to finish what they started. We need to keep moving then. Horse needs rest, so do we. He looked around the clearing, his eyes scanning the tree line with that same alert intensity he'd had since they left the cabin. We'll stay here for an hour. No fire, we eat cold, we stay quiet, and then we move again before dark. She wanted to argue about the wound, about the way he was holding himself like every breath hurt. But she knew he was right. They couldn't afford to stop for long. She sat down on a fallen log, her whole body aching from the ride and the adrenaline crash. Her hands were still shaking, and when she looked down at them, she saw they were covered in small cuts from climbing through the window, dried blood crusted under her nails. Rourke pulled something wrapped in cloth from the saddlebag and tossed it to her. Eat! It was jerky, tough as leather, and salty enough to make her eyes water. But it was food, and her body needed it, so she chewed mechanically, not really tasting it. Rourke sat down a few feet away, not quite close enough to touch, and started checking his rifle. The movements were automatic, practiced, but she could see the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he moved wrong. You saved my life back there, she said quietly. Again. You saved mine too. That shot you fired gave me the opening I needed. I missed. Doesn't matter, you didn't freeze, that's what counts. He set the rifle aside and looked at her. A lot of people would have. She thought about that moment. The gun in her hands, the man choking Rourke, the choice that had felt like no choice at all. I was terrified. Good. Means you're not crazy. He pulled off his glove and touched his throat, where dark bruises were already forming. Fear keeps you alive. It's when you stop being scared that you make mistakes. You don't seem scared. I'm always scared. Just got better at hiding it. The honesty in his voice surprised her. She'd started to think of him as something other than human, some kind of force of nature that didn't feel things the way normal people did. But he did. He was just better at carrying it. Can I ask you something? She said. Depends on what it is. That man I tried to shoot, the one on top of you, did he... She swallowed hard. Did you kill him? Rourke was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was flat, matter of fact. Yeah. How do you live with that? You just do. You don't have a choice. He met her eyes. He was trying to kill me. I did what I had to do, same as you would have if your shot had landed. But I didn't have to live with it. No, I made sure of that. He stood up, moving slowly, and she saw him wince again. That's what I'm here for, Eliza. So you don't have to carry that weight. That's not fair to you. Life's not fair. You know that better than anyone. She did, but hearing him say it, hearing him accept that burden so casually, made something in her chest hurt. Let me look at that wound, she said, standing up. I said later, and I say now. You're bleeding, you're hurt, and if you pass out from blood loss, we're both dead. She moved closer, not backing down. So sit down and let me help you, or I swear I'll hit you over the head and do it while you're unconscious. The corner of his mouth twitched. You threatening me? Yes. All right then. He sat back down and after a moment's hesitation started unbuttoning his shirt. Eliza's breath caught when she saw the wound. It was a gash along his ribs, maybe 4 inches long, deep enough that she could see muscle underneath. Blood had soaked through his shirt and dried in a dark crust, but fresh blood was still seeping out. When did this happen? She asked, her voice tight. When we were fighting. One of them had a knife. Didn't feel it until after. You didn't feel this? Had other things to worry about. She shook her head, not sure whether to be impressed or horrified. Do you have anything to clean it with? He nodded toward the saddlebag. There's a flask in there, whiskey, and some cloth we can use for bandages. She found both and came back, kneeling in front of him. This is going to hurt. Most things do. She poured the whiskey over the wound, and to his credit, he only hissed once. The alcohol foamed pink against his skin, washing away some of the dried blood. She used the cloth to clean around the edges as gently as she could, but there was no gentle way to do this. "It needs stitches," she said. "Don't have a needle." "Then we wrap it tight and hope it doesn't get infected." She tore the cloth into strips and started binding his ribs, pulling the bandage as tight as she dared. Her hands were steadier now, focused on the task. "Tell me if I'm hurting you." "You are." "Tell me if I'm hurting you too much." "You're not." She tied off the bandage and sat back. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. "Try not to get stabbed again." "I'll do my best." Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them. Understanding maybe, or just the shared knowledge that they were both still alive against all odds. Then Rourke looked away, pulling his ruined shirt back on. "We should move soon. Sun's getting lower." "Where are we going?" "North. There's another cabin, maybe 2 days' ride from here. Belongs to a trapper I knew from the war. He owes me a favor." "You think he'll help?" "If he's still alive, yeah. If not, we use the cabin anyway." He stood up slowly, testing his balance. Either way, it's shelter, and it's far enough from Red Hollow that Hackett's going to have a harder time tracking us. Eliza got to her feet, brushing snow off her skirt. What if they don't give up? What if they follow us all the way there? Then we deal with it when it happens. He moved to the horse, checking the saddle. But Hackett's got a town to run. He can't spend forever chasing us through the mountains. At some point, he's going to have to choose between his pride and his survival. And if he chooses pride, Rourke's expression darkened. Then I'll make that choice for him. They mounted up again, Eliza behind Rourke, her arms wrapped around his waist above the bandage. She could feel the heat coming off him, could feel the slight tremor in his muscles that he was trying to hide. He was hurt worse than he was letting on. But they didn't have a choice. They had to keep moving. The horse picked its way through the forest, slower now, conserving its strength. The sun was setting somewhere beyond the clouds, turning the sky a bruised purple-gray. Snow started falling again, light at first, then heavier, until Eliza couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. "We're going to lose the trail," she said. "There is no trail. I'm navigating by landmarks." "What landmarks? Everything looks the same. Not if you know what to look for." He pointed to a dead tree with branches that grew only on one side. "Lightning strike means we're heading the right direction. And if we get turned around, we don't." His confidence should have been reassuring. Instead, it just reminded her how dependent she was on him. If something happened to Rourke, she wouldn't last a day out here. The thought terrified her. They rode in silence as the snow fell heavier, coating everything in white. The temperature was dropping fast, and Eliza's fingers were going numb despite being tucked against Rourke's coat. She was just starting to wonder if they should stop and try to make shelter when she heard it. Voices. Distant, but definitely human. Rourke heard it too. He pulled the horse up short, his whole body going tense. "How many?" Eliza whispered. "Can't tell, but they're behind us, moving fast. They found our trail." "Seems like it." He looked around, his mind working. "We can't outrun them, not in this snow. Horse is exhausted, and they're probably on fresh mounts. So what do we do?" "We make a stand." He dismounted and helped her down, then led the horse off the path into a cluster of large boulders. "Get behind those rocks. Keep your head down." "What are you going to do?" "What I do best." He pulled the rifle from the saddle and checked the ammunition. "I'm going to make them wish they'd stayed in Red Hollow." Eliza's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "There's too many of them." "Probably." "You can't fight them all." "Watch me." He looked at her, and his expression softened just slightly. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She wanted to say no. Wanted to tell him this was suicide, that they should run, that there had to be another way. But she'd learned something about Caleb Rourke in the past few days. When he said he was going to do something, he meant it. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I trust you." He nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the snow. Eliza crouched behind the boulder, the revolver clutched in her shaking hands, and waited. The voices got closer. She could hear them clearly now, men calling to each other, following tracks, getting closer with every second. Then she heard Hackett's voice, sharp and angry. "Trail's fresh. They can't be far." "Spread out," another voice shouted. "Don't let them slip past." Footsteps crunching in the snow, the jingle of tack, heavy breathing. Then Rourke's voice cut through the storm like a blade. That's far enough. The footsteps stopped. Rourke! Hackett's voice had lost some of its confidence. You're cornered. Give up now, and I'll make it quick. No, you won't, but I will. There's 5 of us and 1 of you. You can't win this. I don't have to win. I just have to make you bleed enough that you leave. A pause. Then Hackett tried again, his tone shifting. Look, we can talk about this. Nobody else has to die. Then turn around and go home. You know I can't do that. Then we've got nothing to talk about. The first shot came from somewhere to the left. Eliza heard the crack of the rifle, heard someone scream, and then everything dissolved into chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, muzzle flashes lighting up the snow like lightning. Eliza pressed herself against the boulder, her ears ringing from the noise, her whole body shaking. She heard men shouting, heard someone fall, heard the wet sound of a bullet hitting flesh. Then silence. Not complete silence. She could still hear heavy breathing, the crunch of snow, but the shooting had stopped. Rourke's down, someone shouted. Eliza's blood turned to ice. Where? Over by the rocks. I saw him fall. Footsteps running, getting closer. She gripped the revolver tighter, her hands slick with sweat despite the cold. A man came around the boulder, rifle raised, his face twisted in a mix of triumph and fear. It was one of the Garrett brothers, the one who'd survived the cabin. His eyes locked on her, and his expression shifted to recognition. There you are, you little... Eliza pulled the trigger. The gun kicked so hard it nearly flew from her hands, but she held on, and this time the bullet didn't go wide. It hit Garrett in the chest, and he staggered backward, the rifle falling from his hands. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his coat, then back at her, his expression one of pure shock. Then he fell. Eliza stared at him, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to process what she'd just done. She'd killed someone. She'd actually killed someone. Then hands grabbed her shoulders, and she screamed, spinning around with the gun raised. It's me! Rourke's voice cut through her panic. Eliza, it's me! She looked up at him, her vision blurring with tears she didn't remember starting to cry. He was alive, bleeding from a cut on his forehead and limping badly, but alive. You said you were down, she gasped. I lied. He took the gun from her shaking hands and pulled her to her feet. We need to move. Now. But now, Eliza. She let him pull her along, stepping over Garrett's body without looking down, and they ran through the snow toward where the horse was waiting. Behind them, she could hear more voices, the survivors regrouping, realizing what had happened. How many? She managed to ask. I got 2. You got 1. That leaves 2, maybe 3. He hoisted her onto the horse, then climbed up behind her, his movement slower than before. They'll think twice before following us now. You're hurt. I'll live. He spurred the horse forward, and they plunged back into the storm. They rode hard through the darkness, the snow falling so thick that Eliza couldn't tell if they were going uphill or down. She clung to the saddle horn, her whole body numb from cold and shock. She'd killed a man. The thought kept repeating in her head, over and over, like a drumbeat she couldn't escape. She'd pulled the trigger and watched the life go out of his eyes, and felt nothing but relief that it was him and not her. What did that make her? You did what you had to do, Rourke said, as if reading her thoughts. His voice was rough, strained. He would have killed you if you hadn't. I know. Then don't let it destroy you, you hear me? Don't let it. She nodded against his back, even though she wasn't sure she believed him. They rode for hours, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. All she knew was the cold and the dark, and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves in the snow. Finally, when she thought she couldn't hold on any longer, Rourke pulled up. There, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliza looked up and saw a dark shape through the snow. A building. Small, barely more than a shack, but it had 4 walls and a roof. Is this it? She asked. The trapper's cabin? Yeah. He dismounted, moving stiffly, and nearly fell. Eliza caught him, her arms around his waist, holding him up. You're not okay, she said. No, but I will be. He straightened up, leaning heavily on her, and together they made their way to the door. It wasn't locked. Rourke pushed it open, and they stumbled inside. The cabin was freezing and smelled like dust and animal pelts, but it was shelter. That was enough. Rourke collapsed against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. Eliza knelt beside him, her hands moving to check his wounds. The bandage she'd wrapped around his ribs was soaked through with blood, and she could see a new injury, a bullet graze across his thigh that was bleeding steadily. "When did that happen?" she demanded. "During the fight." He closed his eyes. "Didn't have time to mention it." "You're going to bleed to death." "Probably not." "That's not funny." "Wasn't trying to be." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "There's supplies in the corner. Bandages, needle and thread if you can find it. You're going to have to stitch me up." "I don't know how to do that." "You'll figure it out. You're tougher than you think." She wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. She scrambled to the corner and found an old trunk filled with supplies. Bandages, a bottle of whiskey, and yes, a needle with thread. Her hands were shaking as she came back to him, but she forced them steady. "This is really going to hurt," she said. "I know." He took a long pull from the whiskey bottle, then handed it to her. "You might want some too." She took a drink, the alcohol burning all the way down, then got to work. The stitches were ugly and uneven, and she had to stop twice because her hands were shaking too badly to continue. But Rourke didn't complain. Didn't even make a sound except for the occasional sharp intake of breath. When she was done, she wrapped fresh bandages around both wounds and sat back, exhausted. "Not bad," Rourke said, his voice weak, "for a first try." "You're delirious, Fate." "Maybe." He closed his eyes again. "Thank you." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. Just sat there next to him, listening to his breathing slowly even out as he slipped into sleep. Or unconsciousness. She wasn't sure which. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the darkness, the survivors of Hackett's hunting party were either dead or running for their lives. Eliza looked down at her hands, covered in blood, shaking despite her best efforts, and thought about the man she'd killed. She should feel something, she thought. Guilt, remorse, horror. But all she felt was tired and grateful. Grateful that it was him lying in the snow instead of her. Grateful that Caleb Rourke had stepped into her life when he did. Grateful that she was still alive to feel anything at all. She pulled a blanket from the trunk and draped it over Rourke's unconscious form, then curled up next to him, her head resting against his shoulder. Tomorrow, they would have to figure out what came next. Tomorrow, they would have to decide if they were safe or if Hackett would keep coming. Tomorrow, they would have to face whatever consequences came from the blood they'd spilled. But tonight, they were alive. And that, Eliza thought as her eyes drifted closed, was more than she'd dared to hope for. Eliza woke to the sound of labored breathing. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. The darkness was complete, the cold absolute, and her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Then memory came crashing back. The fight, the shooting, Rourke bleeding on the floor of a stranger's cabin. She sat up fast, her hand reaching for him in the dark. He was burning up. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice cracking. She felt for his face, and his skin was dry and hot under her palm. Fever. The wounds had gotten infected. She scrambled in the darkness, knocking into things, searching for the trunk where she'd found the supplies. Her fingers finally closed around the whiskey bottle, and she pulled the cork with her teeth. "Caleb." She shook his shoulder. "Caleb, wake up." He didn't respond. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and when she pressed her hand to his chest, his heart was racing. She was going to lose him. The thought hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. After everything they'd been through, after all the times he'd saved her, she was going to watch him die in this freezing cabin because she didn't know how to help him. No, she wouldn't let that happen. Eliza forced herself to think, to push past the panic. She needed light, needed to see what she was dealing with. She felt around until she found what felt like a lamp, then matches in a tin box nearby. Her hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to strike one. But finally a small flame caught, and she lit the lamp's wick. The weak yellow light revealed Rourke lying against the wall where she'd left him, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the cold. The bandages around his ribs had bled through again, and she could see red streaks running up from the wound, poison spreading through his blood. She'd seen this before, back in Red Hollow. Mrs. Talbot's husband had died from an infected cut, and it had looked just like this. The fever, the red lines, the way he'd slipped away piece by piece until there was nothing left, But she wasn't going to let that happen to Caleb. First, she needed to clean the wounds again. She unwrapped the bandages as gently as she could, and the smell that came from the knife wound made her gag. It was bad, worse than she'd thought. She poured whiskey over it, and this time Rourke did react, a groan tearing from his throat, his body jerking. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know it hurts, but I have to." She used the cleanest cloth she could find to wash away the pus and blood, working quickly but carefully. The bullet graze on his leg wasn't as bad, but it needed attention too. When both wounds were as clean as she could get them, she wrapped them in fresh bandages, pulling them tight. But it wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. The fever was the real enemy now, and she didn't know how to fight it. She needed water, cold water to bring down his temperature. She grabbed a pot from the corner and went to the door, pushing it open against the snow that had piled up overnight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of white silence. The sun was just starting to rise, turning the sky a pale gray pink, and the cold hit her like a wall. She scooped snow into the pot until it was full, then hurried back inside, slamming the door against the wind. She tore strips from an old shirt she found in the trunk and soaked them in the melted snow, then placed them on Rourke's forehead, his neck, his wrists. Anywhere she could think of to try to cool him down. His eyes opened briefly, unfocused and glassy. "Sarah?" he whispered. Eliza's chest tightened. "No, it's Eliza." "Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have been there." "Caleb, it's not Sarah. It's me." But he wasn't hearing her. He was somewhere else, trapped in memories and fever dreams. "I tried to get back, tried to save you, but I was too late. I'm always too late." "You're not too late," Eliza said, her voice fierce. "You hear me? You saved me. You're not too late." But his eyes had closed again, and his breathing had gone ragged. She spent the rest of the morning fighting for his life. She changed the cold compresses every few minutes, trying to keep his temperature down. She cleaned the wounds again when they started seeping. She forced small sips of water between his lips whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. And she talked to him. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she talked anyway. Told him about growing up in Red Hollow, about her mother who'd died when she was 12, about the years of hunger and cold and working her fingers raw for people who saw her as less than human. She told him things she'd never told anyone. About the night Daniel Cray cornered her, about the times she'd thought about just walking into the wilderness and not coming back, about how close she'd come to giving up. "But then you showed up," she said, wringing out another cloth, "and you looked at me like I was a person, like I mattered. Nobody's done that in so long I'd forgotten what it felt like." She placed the fresh cloth on his forehead, her hand lingering there. "So you don't get to die now, you understand? You don't get to save me and then leave me here alone. That's not how this works." His lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. She leaned closer. "What? Not alone," he breathed. "You're stronger than you know." "I don't feel strong." "You are." His hand moved, finding hers, his grip weak but deliberate. "You killed a man. To save yourself, that's strength. That's just survival." "Same thing." His eyes opened, just barely, and for a moment they were clear. "Don't let them make you small. Never again." Then he slipped back under, and Eliza was left holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. By midday, she'd burned through most of the lamp oil and all of her emotional reserves. She sat against the wall next to Rourke, exhausted beyond measure, watching the rise and fall of his chest. It was steadier now, slower. She didn't know if that was good or bad. The cabin was silent, except for the occasional pop from the small fire she'd managed to build in the hearth. She'd found wood stacked outside, frozen solid, and it had taken her an hour to get even a small flame going. But she'd done it, because Caleb had shown her how to survive, and she wasn't going to waste that lesson. She must have dozed off, because when she opened her eyes again, the light coming through the cracks in the shutters had changed. Afternoon, maybe, or evening. Time had lost meaning. Eliza, her name, spoken clearly, not a whisper, not a fever dream. She turned her head so fast her neck cracked. Rourke was looking at her, his eyes clear for the first time since the fever had taken hold. "You're awake," she said, and her voice came out thick with relief. Barely. He tried to shift and grimaced. How long was I out? A day, maybe more. I don't know. She moved to check his forehead, and the heat was less intense now. Still warm, but not the raging fire it had been. The fever broke, I think. Or it's breaking, I'm not sure. You kept me alive. I tried to kill you with my stitches first, so I figured I owed you. The corner of his mouth twitched. Fair enough? She sat back, suddenly aware of how close she was, how her hand was still on his face. She pulled it away. How do you feel? Like I got shot and stabbed and rode through a blizzard? So, normal then. For me? Yeah. He closed his eyes again, but this time it looked like rest, not unconsciousness. Thank you. You already thanked me. I'm thanking you again, and a lot of people would have run, would have taken the horse and left me here. I thought about it, she admitted. But you didn't. No, I didn't. She pulled the blanket up higher over his chest. I told you I was staying. I meant it. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. My sister's name was Sarah. Eliza went still. I know, you said her name when the fever was bad. I say things I don't mean when I'm like that. No, you say things you mean but won't say when you're awake. She met his eyes. You thought I was her. Yeah. And you were apologizing for not being there when she died. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. I told you what happened. I was fighting a war I didn't believe in, and she was working herself to death in a mill. By the time I got home, she'd been dead for 6 months. That wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I left her. I chose to go fight instead of staying and taking care of her. You were a soldier. You didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. His voice was hard now, angry. I made the wrong one and she paid for it. Eliza thought about that, about the weight he'd been carrying all this time, the guilt that had driven him into these mountains to live alone. Is that why you helped me? She asked. Because you couldn't help her? Maybe. At first? He looked at her, really looked at her. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about her and started being about you. What do you mean? I mean, you're not Sarah. You're Eliza. And you deserve to be saved for your own sake, not because you remind me of someone I lost. The words hit her harder than she expected. All her life she'd been invisible, worthless, someone to be used and discarded. But Caleb Rourke saw her, actually saw her. I don't know what to say to that, she whispered. Don't have to say anything. He shifted again, trying to get more comfortable, and she saw him wince. We should probably figure out what we're doing next. Hackett's men are either dead or gone. I've been watching. Nobody's come near the cabin. You're sure? As sure as I can be. The snow's covered our tracks, and whoever survived that fight is probably halfway back to Red Hollow by now. Or regrouping to come back with more men. Maybe, but I don't think so. She pulled her knees up to her chest. I think we broke them. I think you broke them. We, he corrected. You pulled that trigger when it mattered. That wasn't me. She looked down at her hands, remembering the weight of the gun, the sound it made, the way Garrett had fallen. Does it get easier? She asked. Knowing you killed someone? No, but you learn to live with it. You remember why you did it, and you don't let it turn you into something you're not. What if I'm already turning into something? Then you're turning into a survivor, and there's no shame in that. She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel like what she'd done was justified, necessary, but all she felt was tired. We should eat, she said, changing the subject. You need to keep your strength up. What have we got? Not much. Some dried meat I found in the trunk. Water, that's about it. That'll do. He tried to sit up, and she moved to help him, supporting his weight as he leaned back against the wall. We'll need to hunt tomorrow, assuming I can walk. You're not walking anywhere for at least 3 days. Those wounds need time to heal. We might not have 3 days. Then we make do. But you're not going out there until you can stand without falling over. He looked at her, and something in his expression softened. You're bossy when you want to be. Someone has to keep you from killing yourself. Fair point. She got him some of the dried meat and water, and they ate in comfortable silence. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and outside the wind had picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the shutters. This cabin, Eliza said after a while. You said it belonged to a trapper you knew. What happened to him? No idea. Haven't seen him in 3 years. Could be dead. Could be in California. Could be anywhere. You think he'd mind us being here? If he's alive and he comes back? No. Sam's not that kind of man. He'd give you his last piece of bread if you needed it. Sounds like someone else I know. Rourke shook his head. I'm not that generous. You gave me everything you had, twice. Your cabin, your food, your safety. If that's not generous, I don't know what is. That's different. How? He was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was low. Because you reminded me what it feels like to give a damn about something other than surviving. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Eliza didn't know how to respond, didn't know if she should respond. So she did the only thing she could think of. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her, and something in his eyes made her chest ache. We're going to make it through this, she said. Both of us. You sound pretty sure about that. I am, because I'm not letting you die, and you're not letting me give up. We're stuck with each other now. The corner of his mouth lifted. Could be worse. Could be a lot worse. They sat like that for a while, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, Eliza felt something other than fear or exhaustion. She felt hope, real hope. Not the desperate, fragile thing that could shatter at any moment, but something solid, something built on the understanding that she wasn't alone anymore. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Eliza insisted on taking the first shift, and Rourke was too weak to argue effectively. She sat by the window, the revolver in her lap, watching the moonlight turn the snow-covered landscape into something almost beautiful. She thought about Red Hollow, about the people who'd wanted her dead for the crime of being hungry, about Hackett and his men, some of whom were probably lying frozen in the wilderness because they'd chased her this far. She should feel guilty about that, but she didn't. They'd made their choice, had chosen pride and cruelty over common sense, and they'd paid for it. She'd made her choice too, had chosen to fight instead of surrender, had chosen to live instead of die, and she'd do it again in a heartbeat. When her watch was over, she woke Rourke and took his place by the fire. She was asleep almost before her head hit the folded blanket she was using as a pillow. She dreamed of her mother, of the small house they'd lived in before the fever, of the way her mother had sung while she worked, of the feeling of being loved unconditionally. When she woke, it was to the smell of something cooking. She sat up, disoriented, and saw Rourke at the hearth, stirring something in a pot over the fire. You're supposed to be resting, she said, her voice rough with sleep. I rested. Now I'm cooking. You can barely stand. I'm standing fine. To prove it, he turned to face her, though she noticed he kept one hand braced against the wall. Found some wild onions and mushrooms stored in a root cellar outside. Not much, but it'll make the dried meat taste like actual food. She stood up and stretched, her whole body protesting. Let me help. Already done. Just needs a few more minutes. She moved to stand next to him, looking down at the pot. It smelled better than anything had a right to smell given the ingredients. You're a decent cook, she said. Had a lot of practice. Hard to stay alive in the wilderness if you can't make food edible. You could have taught me instead of doing it yourself. Next time. He ladled the stew into 2 wooden bowls he'd found somewhere and handed her one. Eat. You haven't had a proper meal since we got here. They sat at the small table, eating in silence. The stew was simple but good, and Eliza felt strength returning to her body with every bite. What's your plan? Rourke asked after a while. After all this is over, after we're safe. I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead. Maybe you should. She set her spoon down. Why? You trying to get rid of me? No. Opposite, actually. I'm trying to figure out if you want to stay. Stay? Where? Here, with me. Not this cabin. We'll have to move eventually, find somewhere more permanent, but... He paused, searching for words. I've spent 3 years alone in these mountains. Thought that was what I needed, but maybe I was wrong. Eliza's heart was beating fast. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you want to stay, build something here, you'd be welcome. More than welcome. You mean it? I don't say things I don't mean. She thought about it, Really thought about it. A life in the wilderness, far from towns and people and the cruelty she'd known her whole life. A life with someone who saw her as an equal, who valued her strength instead of trying to break it. What would we do? She asked. Survive. Hunt, trap, trade with the settlements when we need to. It's not easy, but it's honest. And it's free. Free, she repeated, testing the word. I like the sound of that. So that's a yes? She met his eyes. On one condition. What's that? You stop trying to protect me from everything. I'm not fragile. I'm not your sister. I can handle myself. He considered that. You want to be treated like an equal? I want to be an equal. All right. Then you are. Partners. Partners, she agreed. He held out his hand and she shook it, their agreement sealed. For the first time in her life, Eliza felt like she belonged somewhere. Not because someone was letting her stay out of pity or obligation, but because she'd earned her place. And that made all the difference. Over the next few days, Rourke healed slowly but steadily. The infection receded, the wound started to close, and the color returned to his face. Eliza kept him from doing too much too soon, which led to several arguments that usually ended with her threatening to tie him to the bed if he didn't sit down. She learned how to set snares, how to read weather patterns, how to find water under ice. Rourke taught her everything he knew, treating her like a student instead of a burden. And she discovered something surprising. She was good at this. Not perfect. She made mistakes, got frustrated, failed more often than she succeeded at first. But she learned. And she got better. One afternoon, she came back from checking the snares with 2 rabbits, and the look of approval on Rourke's face made her feel like she'd conquered the world. Not bad, he said, inspecting her catch. Not bad. That's it? What do you want? A medal? A little more enthusiasm would be nice. He smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Fine. You did great. Happy? Getting there. Boy, they cleaned the rabbits together, and Eliza found she didn't mind the blood and mess as much as she thought she would. It was necessary, part of survival, part of her new life. That night, as they sat by the fire eating rabbit stew, Rourke broke the comfortable silence. We should talk about what happens when spring comes. What about it? We can't stay here forever. This cabin's not ours. And eventually Sam might come back. We need to find our own place. Where? There's land further north. Good hunting, fresh water, far enough from any town that we won't have neighbors. He poked at the fire with a stick. We could build something there. Small at first, but solid. A cabin? A home. The word hit her with unexpected force. Home. She'd never had one of those. Not really. You think we can do it? She asked. Just the 2 of us? Yeah, I do. It won't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is. She thought about Red Hollow, about the square where she'd been tied to a chair, about the people who'd wanted her blood. Do you think Hackett will let this go? She asked. Or will he keep looking for us? Honestly, I think he's got bigger problems. We killed 3 of his men, wounded at least 1 more. That's a lot of explaining to do to the people in town. And if word gets out that he lost a fight with 1 man and a girl he called worthless? Rourke shook his head. His authority's probably already crumbling. Good. He deserves it. Maybe. But it doesn't matter what he deserves. What matters is we're free of him. Free. That word again. Eliza tested it in her mind, turning it over, examining it from every angle, and she realized it was true. She was free. Not because someone had given her permission, but because she'd fought for it, had bled for it, had killed for it, and she'd do it again if she had to. When do we leave? She asked. Soon as I can ride without falling off the horse. Another week, maybe. Then we better start preparing. He looked at her, something like pride in his eyes. We better. A week later, they were ready. Rourke could walk without grimacing, could move without favoring his wounds too much. The horse had recovered from the hard riding, fed on the grain they'd found stored in the cellar. They packed what supplies they could carry, the rifle, ammunition, dried meat, blankets, a few tools from the cabin that Sam wouldn't miss if he ever came back. On their last night in the cabin, Eliza stood at the window, looking out at the mountains under the stars. You all right? Rourke asked from behind her. Yeah, just thinking. About what? About how different everything is now. A month ago, I was tied to a chair waiting to die. And now, she turned to face him. Now I'm about to start a whole new life. Scared? Terrified, but in a good way, like standing on the edge of something and knowing you're about to jump. That's as good a description as any. He moved to stand beside her. For what it's worth, I'm glad you're jumping with me. Me too. They stood in silence for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the wilderness that would be their home. Then Rourke spoke, his voice quiet. I'm not good at this. At letting people in. At being part of something bigger than just survival. Neither am I. But I want to try. If you're willing to put up with me. She looked at him, at this man who'd risked everything for a stranger, who taught her that she was worth saving. I'm willing, she said, and she meant it with every part of her being. The next morning, they rode out as the sun rose, painting the snow gold in pink. They didn't look back. There was nothing behind them worth remembering. Everything that mattered was ahead. The journey north took them 5 days. They traveled slowly, carefully, avoiding anything that looked like a settlement or a road. The landscape changed as they climbed higher. The trees thinned out, the peaks grew sharper, and the air got so cold that breathing hurt. But there was a beauty to it that Eliza had never noticed before. Maybe because she'd never had the chance to just look at the world without fear hanging over her shoulder. The way the light hit the ice in the morning, turning everything silver. The absolute silence that came after a fresh snowfall. The stars at night, so many of them she couldn't begin to count. You're smiling, Rourke said one evening as they made camp. Am I? Yeah, first time I've seen it look natural on you. She touched her face, almost surprised. I guess I am. What's funny? Nothing's funny. I just realized I'm happy. She looked at him. Is that strange? After everything that happened? No, it's human. He was building a fire, arranging the kindling with the same precision he did everything. You spent so long just trying to survive that you forgot what it feels like to actually live. Now you're remembering. What about you? Are you happy? He paused, considering the question seriously. I don't know if happy's the right word, but I'm not angry anymore. That's something. You were angry? For years. At the world, at myself, at everything. It's exhausting carrying that around. He struck the flint, and sparks caught in the dry grass. But somewhere between Red Hollow and here, I let it go. Why? Because being angry at the past doesn't change it, and I've got better things to focus on now. The fire caught, and he sat back, satisfied. Eliza watched the flames grow, thinking about his words. She'd carried her own anger for so long, at her mother for dying, at Red Hollow for grinding her down, at herself for not being strong enough to escape sooner. But maybe Rourke was right. Maybe holding on to it was just another kind of prison. I killed a man, she said quietly, and I don't feel sorry about it. Good. Don't. But doesn't that make me just as bad as them, Hackett and his men? No. Rourke's voice was firm. They wanted to kill you because they could, because hurting someone weaker made them feel powerful. You killed to survive. There's a difference. Is there? We both ended lives. Intent matters. They chose cruelty. You chose life. He poked at the fire. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for refusing to die quietly. She nodded, but the weight of it still sat heavy in her chest. Maybe it always would. Maybe that was the price of survival, carrying the memory of what you had to do to stay alive. But she could live with that. She had to. On the 6th day, they found it. The valley opened up before them like something out of a dream, a wide clearing surrounded by forest, with a stream running through the middle that wasn't completely frozen. The mountains rose on 3 sides, providing natural shelter from the worst of the wind. Here, Rourke said, pulling the horse to a stop. Eliza looked around, trying to see what he saw. You're sure? Fresh water, timber for building, good hunting, natural barriers. He dismounted and walked to the center of the clearing, turning in a slow circle. This is it. She climbed down and stood beside him, trying to imagine a cabin here, a home, their home. It felt impossible and inevitable at the same time. When do we start? She asked. Tomorrow. Today we rest and scout the area. Make sure we're really alone. They spent the afternoon exploring their new territory. Rourke showed her how to read the land, where animals traveled, where the best timber grew, which areas would flood when the snow melted in spring. She learned fast, asking questions, making mental notes. This was hers now, hers and Caleb's, and she was going to know every inch of it. That night, they slept under the stars, wrapped in blankets by a small fire. The horse grazed nearby, content for the first time in days. Eliza lay on her back, looking up at the sky, and felt something shift inside her. A settling, like a bone that had been out of joint for years finally clicking back into place. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you for everything. You've already thanked me. I'm thanking you again, and I'll probably keep thanking you, so get used to it. She heard him chuckle softly. All right, you're welcome. Again. Silence settled over them, comfortable and warm despite the cold. Then Rourke spoke, his voice quiet. Sarah would have liked you. Eliza turned her head to look at him. Your sister? Yeah, she had your kind of strength. Quiet, but solid. The kind that doesn't break even when it should. I wish I could have met her. Me too. He was quiet for a moment. I think she'd be glad I'm not alone anymore. You think she's watching somewhere? I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe she's just gone and all we have are the memories. He shifted, turning to face her. Either way, I like to think she'd approve of this. Of you. Eliza's throat tightened. I hope so. They fell asleep like that, facing each other across the dying fire. Two survivors finding their way towards something that looked like peace. The work began the next morning. Building a cabin from scratch was brutal. Eliza had thought she knew what hard work was. Years of hauling water and chopping wood and scrubbing floors had taught her about exhaustion. But this was different. This was felling trees with a hand axe, dragging logs twice her weight through snow, notching and fitting and raising walls one piece at a time. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached constantly. She fell into bed, which was just blankets on the ground, so tired she couldn't even feel the cold. But she didn't complain, because this was different from the work in Red Hollow. This wasn't for someone else's benefit. This was hers. Every log she hauled, every notch she cut, every wall she helped raise was building something that belonged to her. And that made all the difference. Rourke worked beside her, teaching her as they went. How to choose the right trees, how to strip bark, how to fit logs tight enough to keep out the wind. He never got impatient when she made mistakes, never made her feel stupid for not knowing things. You're doing good, he said one afternoon, watching her work a log into place. I'm half your speed. Speed doesn't matter. Quality does. And you're getting the quality right. She sat back, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cold. How long did it take you to learn all this? Years. My father was a carpenter before he died. Taught me the basics when I was young. The rest I picked up during the war, after. Must be nice having someone teach you. It is. That's why I'm teaching you. She looked at him, really looked at him. His face was weathered, his hands scarred, his body marked by violence and survival. But there was kindness in his eyes, patience. You're a good teacher, she said. You're a good student. They went back to work, and Eliza found herself smiling despite the ache in her muscles. 3 weeks into the build, the first wall went up. It wasn't much, just one side of what would eventually be a cabin, but standing there looking at it, Eliza felt a surge of pride so intense it almost knocked her over. We did that, she said, her voice full of wonder. We did. It's real. It is. She walked over and pressed her hand against the rough wood, feeling the solidity of it. This was real. This was happening. She was building a life, not just surviving one. Can I tell you something? She asked. Always. I used to dream about this. Not exactly this, but something like it. A place that was mine, where nobody could take it away or tell me I didn't deserve it. She traced her fingers along the wood grain. I never thought it would actually happen. Sometimes the things we think are impossible are just waiting for the right moment. Is that what this is? The right moment? I think so. Yeah. She turned to face him. What changed for you, I mean? What made you decide to stop hiding in the mountains and build something new? He thought about it, his eyes distant. I think I was waiting for a reason, for something worth building for. He met her gaze. Then you showed up, tied to a chair in a town square, and I realized, this is it. This is the reason. I'm the reason you're building a cabin? No, you're the reason I'm building a life. The weight of those words settled between them, heavy and meaningful. Eliza didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to express what she was feeling, gratitude and fear and hope all tangled together. So she did the only thing she could think of. She stepped forward and hugged him. He went still for a moment, surprised. Then his arms came around her, careful but firm, and they stood there in the snow next to the wall they'd built together. Thank you, she whispered against his chest. For what? For seeing me. For believing I was worth saving. You're worth saving. Don't ever doubt that. They held each other for a long moment, and Eliza realized this was what safety felt like. Not walls or weapons or distance from danger, but connection. Trust. Someone who had your back no matter what. She'd never had that before. And now that she did, she was never letting it go. The cabin took shape slowly over the following weeks. 4 walls went up, then a roof frame. They chinked the gaps with moss and mud to keep out the wind. Rourke built a stone hearth with rocks from the stream, fitting them together so precisely there were barely any gaps. Eliza learned to hunt. Her first few attempts were disasters. She spooked the game, missed her shots, came back empty-handed and frustrated. But Rourke was patient, showed her how to move quietly, how to read tracks, how to wait instead of rushing. And eventually, she brought down a deer. It wasn't a clean kill. Her shot was a little off, and she had to track it for half a mile before she found it. But when she did, when she knelt beside the animal and felt the weight of what she'd done, something in her shifted. She could do this. Could actually survive out here. Could build a life that didn't depend on anyone else's charity or cruelty. When she dragged the deer back to camp, dragged it halfway before Rourke found her and helped, the look of pride on his face made every blister and bruise worth it. First kill, he said, helping her string it up to bleed out. Yeah. How do you feel? Tired, proud, a little sick. That's normal. Taking a life, even for food, isn't something you should take lightly. I won't. They processed the deer together, and Rourke showed her how to preserve the meat, how to use every part of the animal. Hide for leather, bones for tools, sinew for thread. Nothing wasted. Everything valued, just like her. By the time the first signs of spring appeared, water dripping from icicles, the occasional bird call, the cabin was finished. It was small, simple. The floor was packed earth, the furniture was rough-hewn, and the whole thing probably would have made a city person laugh. But to Eliza, it was perfect. On the first night they slept inside, actually inside with walls and a roof and a door that closed. She lay on her bedroll staring at the ceiling and felt tears sliding down her temples. You all right? Rourke asked from his side of the room. Yeah, just... She wiped her eyes. I never had a home before. Not really. And now I do. We do. Yeah, we do. She fell asleep listening to the fire crackle and the wind outside that couldn't touch her anymore. Spring came fast after that, the snow melting in rushing streams, the world turning from white to green almost overnight. Eliza and Rourke fell into a rhythm, hunting, gathering, maintaining the cabin, preparing for the next winter. They worked side by side during the day and sat by the fire at night, talking about everything and nothing. She learned about his time in the war, not the violence, which he still didn't like to discuss, but the people he'd known, the places he'd seen. He learned about her childhood, about her mother's stories, about the small moments of beauty she'd found even in Red Hollow. They shared their scars, literal and otherwise. And slowly, carefully, they built something neither of them had words for yet. One evening in late spring, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. Rourke was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Eliza grabbed the revolver, her heart racing, but the rider raised both hands, showing he was unarmed. Easy, the man called. I'm not here to fight. Then state your business, Rourke shouted back. The rider came closer, and as he did, Eliza could see he was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and a weathered face. He looked familiar somehow. Rourke, the man said, squinting. Caleb Rourke? Sam? Rourke lowered the rifle slightly. That you? Yeah, it's me. The trapper, because that's who this had to be, dismounted and walked forward slowly. Heard you were up this way. Wanted to see if the rumors were true. What rumors? That you killed half of Red Hollow's men and burned down your own cabin defending some girl they tried to hang. Sam's eyes found Eliza. I'm guessing that's her? She's got a name, Eliza said, stepping forward. Eliza Boone. Sam looked her up and down, then nodded approvingly. Pleasure. Anyone who can piss off Hackett that badly is all right in my book. You know Hackett? Rourke asked. Know of him. He's been running Red Hollow like his personal kingdom for years. Word is he's lost his grip since you embarrassed him. Town's in chaos. Some people are calling for him to step down. Good, Eliza said. He deserves worse. Sam grinned. I like her. She's got fire. He looked around the clearing, taking in the cabin, the neat stacks of firewood, the small garden plot Eliza had started. You two building a life up here? Trying to, Rourke said. Looks like you're succeeding. Sam scratched his beard. Listen, I came up here for a reason. There's talk in the settlements, people saying Hackett's putting together a bigger group, planning to come after you when the weather clears. Eliza felt her stomach drop. How many? Don't know for sure, 10, maybe 15. He's offering money to anyone willing to ride. Rourke's jaw tightened. When? Soon, week or two probably. They were silent for a moment, the weight of it settling over them. Then Eliza spoke, her voice hard. Let them come. Both men looked at her. Eliza, Rourke started. No, I'm done running. We built this place. We earned this land, and I'm not letting Hackett or anyone else take it from us. There's 15 of them, Rourke said carefully. Then we'll be smart. We'll prepare. We'll make this place defensible. She looked at him. You said I was your partner, that we were equals, so treat me like one. What do we do? Rourke studied her face for a long moment. Then something in his expression shifted, resolve settling in. We dig in, he said. We fortify. And we make anyone who comes here regret it. Sam whistled low. You two are either very brave or very stupid. Probably both, Eliza said. In that case, I'm in. They both stared at him. What? Sam shrugged. I don't like bullies, and I've got nothing better to do. Besides, someone needs to make sure you kids don't get yourselves killed. Rourke clasped his shoulder. Appreciate it, Sam. Don't thank me yet. We've got a lot of work to do. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Sam knew how to build defensive positions, trenches, barriers, sight lines. Rourke knew tactics, and Eliza learned fast, her hands moving with purpose as they transformed their peaceful home into something that could withstand a siege. They dug rifle pits, built barriers from logs, stockpiled ammunition and food and water. They planned fields of fire, escape routes, contingencies for every scenario they could imagine. And through it all, Eliza felt something growing inside her. Not fear. Not anymore. Determination. She'd spent her whole life being pushed around, told she was worthless, treated like something less than human. But she wasn't that person anymore. She was Eliza Boone. She'd survived Red Hollow. She'd killed to stay alive. She'd built a home with her own hands, and she'd be damned if she let anyone take it from her. They came on a clear morning 3 weeks later. Eliza saw them first, riders cresting the ridge to the south. Too many to count at first glance. She ran to the cabin where Rourke was checking ammunition. They're here. He didn't ask how many, just nodded and grabbed his rifle. Sam was already in position in one of the trenches, his own rifle ready. They'd talked about this, planned for it. Now it was just a matter of execution. The riders came closer, spreading out as they approached the clearing. Eliza counted 14 of them, all armed, all looking grim and determined. Hackett was at the front, his face twisted with rage and something that looked like desperation. They stopped at the edge of the clearing just out of rifle range. Rourke, Hackett's voice carried across the distance. Send out the girl, and we'll let you live. No, Rourke shouted back. You're outnumbered. You can't win. Maybe not, but we'll make you bleed for every inch. Hackett conferred with his men. Eliza could see some of them shaking their heads, looking uncertain. Good. They should be scared. Last chance, Hackett shouted. Walk away now or die here. Rourke looked at Eliza. You ready? She checked her revolver, her hands steady. Ready. He smiled, fierce and proud. Then let's show them what happens when you corner desperate people. The first shot came from Hackett's side. It went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet from the cabin. Rourke fired back, and one of Hackett's men fell from his horse. Then it was chaos. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Bullets slammed into the barriers they'd built, thudded into the cabin walls. The air filled with smoke and noise and the screams of wounded men and horses. But Rourke and Sam and Eliza fought with precision. They'd chosen their positions carefully, built their defenses well. Every shot had to count. Eliza fired, reloaded, fired again. She didn't think about the men she was shooting at, just focused on the mechanical process. Aim, breathe, squeeze the trigger. One of Hackett's men tried to flank them, coming through the trees to the east. Sam saw him and fired. The man went down. Another tried to rush the cabin. Eliza shot him from the window. He fell 5 feet from the door. The attack lasted maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, 7 of Hackett's men were down. The rest were retreating, dragging their wounded with them. Hackett himself was unhurt, but the look on his face was one of pure defeat. He'd lost, again. And this time, he knew it. This isn't over, he screamed from a safe distance. Yes, it is, Eliza shouted back, stepping out from the cabin. Her voice rang across the clearing, clear and strong. You wanted to make an example of me, to show everyone what happens when someone like me steps out of line. Well, look around, look at your men, look at what it cost you. She walked forward, gun at her side, but ready. I'm done being afraid of you, done being what you wanted me to be. I'm building a life here, and you can't stop me. None of you can. The silence that followed was absolute. Hackett stared at her, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. If you come back, Eliza said, her voice deadly calm, we'll be waiting, and next time you won't ride away. Do you understand me? Hackett's mouth opened, then closed. He had no words, no threats left. He turned his horse and rode away, his remaining men following. They didn't look back. Eliza stood in the clearing, watching them disappear, her heart pounding but her hands steady. Rourke came up beside her. You all right? Yeah, I think I am. Sam emerged from his position, grinning. That was one hell of a speech, girl. Thanks. She looked at the bodies scattered around the clearing. What do we do with them? We bury them, Rourke said, out past the tree line, with respect. They were wrong, but they don't deserve to rot where we can see them. It took the rest of the day to dig graves and bury the dead. It was grim work, but necessary. And as she helped lower the last body into the ground, Eliza felt something she hadn't expected. Pity. These men had died for Hackett's pride, for a town's cruel sense of justice, for reasons that didn't matter anymore. They'd made their choices. But so had she. And she'd chosen to live. That night, as they sat around the fire, Sam raised a cup of whiskey. To survival, he said. To survival, Rourke echoed. Eliza raised her own cup. To freedom. They drank, and the whiskey burned going down, but it felt like celebration. Sam left the next morning, promising to spread word in the settlements that Hackett had been beaten, that anyone who came after them would face the same fate. You two take care of each other, he said as he mounted his horse. We will, Eliza promised, and if you need anything, you know where to find me. Thanks, Sam, for everything. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving them alone in their clearing. Eliza and Rourke stood side by side, watching him go. Think he's right? Eliza asked. That word will spread and people will leave us alone? Eventually, fear's a powerful motivator. Is that what we are now? Something to be feared? No, we're something better. We're people who refuse to be victims. She thought about that, about the journey from that square in Red Hollow to here, about everything she'd learned, everything she'd become. I killed 3 people, she said quietly. Does that make me a monster? No, it makes you a survivor. There's a difference. How do you know? Because a monster wouldn't ask the question. She nodded, accepting that. What do we do now? We live. We build. We make this place into something worth defending. He turned to look at her. We prove that people like us, people the world tried to break, we can still create something beautiful. Is that what this is? Beautiful? I think so. Yeah. Eliza looked around, at the cabin they'd built, at the land they'd claimed, at the life they'd carved out of the wilderness. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect, but it was theirs. And that made it beautiful. I love it here, she said. Good, because I'm not planning on leaving. Neither am I. They went back inside, and as Eliza closed the door behind them, she realized something. For the first time in her entire life, she felt safe. Not because there were no threats, there would always be threats, but because she knew she could handle them. Because she wasn't alone anymore. Because she'd found someone who saw her as an equal, who valued her strength, who believed she was worth fighting for. And because she'd finally learned to believe it herself. The months that followed were peaceful. They expanded the cabin, adding a second room, planted a larger garden, trapped and hunted and traded with the few trappers who passed through. Word did spread just as Sam predicted. Stories of the girl who'd faced down Hackett's men and won. Of the man who'd burned his cabin to save her. Of the couple who'd built a fortress in the mountains and defended it against impossible odds. People left them alone after that. Some out of fear. Some out of respect. Eliza didn't care which. Summer came, and with it, long days of work and longer evenings sitting outside watching the sun set over the mountains. One night, as they sat by the fire, Rourke spoke. I've been thinking. About what? About Sarah. About the life she never got to have. He poked at the fire. I used to think the best way to honor her was to punish myself, to live alone and never let anyone in. And now? Now I think the best way to honor her is to actually live, to build something good, to be happy. He looked at Eliza. She would have wanted that. I think she would have wanted you to be happy even if I'd never shown up. Maybe, but you did show up, and that changed everything. Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. I'm glad I showed up, she said. Me too. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one, and Eliza realized something. She'd spent so many years thinking happiness was something other people got to have, something she didn't deserve, but she'd been wrong. Happiness wasn't something you deserved or didn't deserve. It was something you built, something you fought for, something you protected with everything you had, and she'd built it here, in this clearing, with this man who'd seen her worth when no one else had. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a child. It was better, because it was real, because it was earned, because every scar and callous and hard-won lesson had led her here, to this moment, to this place, to this life. Caleb, she said. Yeah? I know we said we're partners, equals. We are. I know, but I think... She paused, searching for the right words. I think we're more than that now. Aren't we? He was quiet for a moment, then he shifted so he could look at her properly. Yeah, he said softly. We are. What does that make us? I don't know, but I know I don't want to do this life without you. Good, because you're stuck with me. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that made him look younger. I can live with that. They kissed then, slow and careful, sealing a promise neither of them needed to speak out loud. When they pulled apart, Eliza rested her forehead against his. We did it, she whispered. We actually made it. We did. What happens now? Whatever we want. That's the beauty of freedom. She thought about that word again. Freedom. It had seemed impossible once, a dream too big to hold, but she was holding it now, living it, breathing it, and she was never letting go. The fire burned low, and eventually they went inside, closing the door on the wilderness and the past and everything that had tried to destroy them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new moments of doubt and fear and struggle, but they'd face it together. Two people who'd been broken by the world and had chosen to rebuild themselves into something stronger. Two survivors who'd learned that the opposite of cruelty wasn't kindness, it was dignity. And they'd found it here, in the mountains, far from the judgment of people who'd never understood what it took to keep breathing when everything told you to give up. Eliza lay down on her bed, her actual bed, in her actual home, and felt Caleb's hand find hers in the dark. Thank you, she said one more time. For what? For stepping into that square. for seeing me, for giving me a reason to believe I was worth saving. You saved yourself, Eliza. I just gave you the chance. Then thank you for the chance. You're welcome. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since her mother died, she fell asleep feeling loved. Not because the world had decided she deserved it, but because she decided it for herself. And that made all the difference. In the end, this wasn't a story about revenge or justice or even survival. It was a story about what happens when two broken people find each other and decide that broken doesn't mean worthless, that the world doesn't get to define you, that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is simply refusing to disappear. Caleb Rourke had stepped into that square in Red Hollow, not because he was a hero, but because he was human. Because he'd seen something in Eliza Boone that reminded him what he'd lost, and more importantly, what he could still find. And Eliza had fought her way out of that nightmare not because she was fearless, but because she'd learned that fear and courage could exist in the same moment. Together, they'd proven something that towns like Red Hollow didn't want to acknowledge. That the people they tried to break were often the strongest. That compassion and strength weren't opposites. That a single act of courage could change everything. They'd built more than a cabin in those mountains. They'd built proof that survival wasn't enough. That you could reach for something better. That you could take all the pain and fear and loss that life handed you and turn it into something worth living for. And every morning when Eliza woke up in that cabin, looked out at the mountains they'd claimed and felt Caleb's presence beside her, she knew one thing for certain. She was home. Not because of where she was, but because of who she'd become. And no one, not Hackett, not Red Hollow, not the entire cruel world, could ever take that away from her. That was freedom. That was victory. That was life. And it was finally, completely, absolutely hers.